Greetings, everyone. This is Mark Kenoyer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm here to present a talk on the role of marine shell in the ornaments, arts, and rituals of the Indus tradition, 7000 to 1900 BCE. I am very thankful to the organizers and honored to be able to present this keynote address. I also want to especially thank Dr. Arati Deshpande Mukherjee for the invitation to present this address. I also want to thank the Harappa Archaeological Research Project and to all my colleagues and students who have shared information and advice. Also the Department of Archaeology and Museums, Government of Pakistan, for allowing us to work at the site, and the many curators at Harappa and their staff who've helped us with the excavations and documentation. I also want to thank the Archaeological Survey of India for allowing me to study materials in museums in India, and the numerous funding agencies, especially Harappa.com, which has provided a platform for disseminating the knowledge of the Indus. I also want to thank the late Dr. George F. Dales and Mrs. Barbara Dales. He was my advisor at Berkeley, who contributed so much to the study of the Indus. His work was an inspiration to me, and I hope that my work can be inspiration to many other people. Thanks to all the projects that allowed me to study the materials from their excavations in Pakistan, in India, in Oman, and Kuwait, and also my colleagues here in the US who've helped me to study these materials. Today I'm going to focus on marine shell ornaments that were used in the Indus civilization or Indus tradition, and this is a tradition that emerges alongside other important early urban societies. The main linkages are with Mesopotamia and the Gulf area, but we have links to Central Asia and indirectly to other regions of the Old World. Marine shell used as ornaments are among the earliest trade items linking the coastal regions with the interior and the Indus with other distant cultural areas. And ornaments, both shell ornaments and decorative objects, provide an important window on a culture by demonstrating the efforts expended in creating objects that are public symbols of identity, gender, wealth, and status. And we'll be looking at different aspects of shell ornaments in the Indus and trying to link them to specific ideologies and role that they would have had in that ancient society. My early dissertation work was looking at the trade of shell materials, and I argued that the analysis of trade items from the coastal marine shell items to the inland demonstrates three different types of levels of exchange. We have local or regional coastal trade, so people along the coast would interacting with each other. Sometimes one coast would interact with another coast, so we have shells that were probably from this region found in Lothal. We have shells found in this region also in the inland areas, and it's possibly that shells from Muscat or Oman were also being brought to the Indus Valley as trade. We have extra-regional contacts between cities and distant resource areas. So Harappa and Mohenjo-daro are very far inland, Rakigarhi, Ganveriwala. These are sites that have had to get access to shell by trading down the river systems and then acquiring these from great distances. And then we have long distance or international exchange. And we can see items of shell from the Indus civilization being traded to Central Asia, to Iran, to Mesopotamia, to the Gulf area, and far inland into the interior of the subcontinent. So these are the three major levels that I was able to identify in my dissertation. The chronology that I'll be talking about, I'll be mainly talking about the Indus tradition, but just so that people who have this available, the early food producing era is the time that we will start looking at, around 7000 BCE. And this is equal to some of the early foraging in the Oman region, as well as the early Ubaid and Chalcolithic, Neolithic in Mesopotamia. We will then discuss the regionalization era, which I've just given a brief presentation of, some important points, which we will talk about. This is a period of time when we have links between the Indus and Mesopotamia and Central Asia, and then we'll have the integration era, which is the main phase of urbanism during the Indus, and then we will discuss the late localization era during the late Harappan. And during the late Harappan, we have very little or no evidence for shell in the inland areas and just a little bit on the coast. I'll be talking about many different species of shell, but one of my main species that I'll focus on is called Turbine Laperum, which is the shank, which is very famous. It's a sacred shell found in South Asia. This species is only found along the coastal areas of Makran and in Kutch, and also now in South India, but during the Indus period, they did not get shank from South India. They got it from Kutch and from Makran. We also have other species which have a wider distribution. They are also found along the coastal areas of Pakistan and Western India, but they are also found in the Gulf, and we will talk a little bit more about the possibilities of their exchange. So around 7000 BCE, the site of Mehergarh is one of our key sites for understanding the linkage between inland regions and the coast. And excavations here showed presence of shells that were clearly from the Makran coast being brought either along the Indus up to Mehergarh in the Kutchi plain, or from the Dasht River Valley through the highlands of Baluchistan to that region. Other species of shell were also found that are not found here today. They may have been found in the past, but they are very common in the Gulf. So large conus, Engina mendicaria, may have been brought to the Indus from this region, and this suggests that there might be links even as early as 7000 BCE between the Gulf region and Baluchistan. We do know from pottery studies by Sophie Marie that many of the ceramic traditions that we see emerging in the UAE and Oman derive from linkages to ceramic traditions in Baluchistan. So this would not be surprising, and it's not very far between these coasts. We also see movement of turquoise from Iran to Mehergarh and Baluchistan to Mehergarh from Chagi. We also see lapis lazuli coming down to Mehergarh. And because of these northern links that are with stone, we can also assume that people who were coming down would have been able to see shell and maybe take shell to the north. And we don't have clear evidence for this at this time period, but we do have it for a slightly later time period. The site of Mehergarh is one of the most important sites for understanding the early Neolithic period, thanks to the team of the French Archaeological Mission and their Pakistani colleagues. Jean-François Jarige was the leader, as well as his wife, Catherine Jarige, and many other the team members. This 10-meter deposit is the pre-ceramic Neolithic levels at Mehergarh and provided really clear evidence for the early use of shell. And I studied this for my dissertation, so I was able to actually look at these materials firsthand. In some of the burials, we have evidence for offerings. Here are some goats that were offered, but then this individual had a necklace of a conus ring, or a conus disc, as well as lapis lazuli and turquoise. The ankle bracelets were made from a limestone, which is a white stone, maybe replicating shell, and we have tiny white beads that were made from shell as well as local stone. So this is a combination of stone and shell. This presence of these types of materials indicates movement over great distances to come to this site. Another burial, which is one of the most important for me, is the burial that shows the use of a shell bangle. This is the first bangle, or evidence for a bangle of the Indus tradition. And this is a large gauntlet or kangan made from a shank, and the tip was cut off and chipped from both ends. The central columella was chipped away, very complicated technique, without breaking the main whorl. And then it was ground and shaped and polished. There's a small hole drilled on the side, maybe for a tassel, and it was something that was worn by this woman. So this is the earliest evidence for the use of shell as an important ornament that was then taken into the afterlife. This individual also had Engina mendicaria and dentalium shell beads, so we have several of those in these necklaces. The tradition started at 7000, but it continued in the later period. So in the later periods at the site of Shahitump, which is just along the Makran coast, we have evidence from period 2 of bangles made again of a single large shunk or Turbine Laperum shell. These ones did not have the edges taken off. They were left with this long portion, but they were smooth on the inside, which requires a great deal of labor. And these photographs are courtesy of Roland Bessenval, the French archaeological mission to Pakistan, who excavated Shahi Tump and other sites along the Makran coast. At Harappa, when I did my dissertation research, I documented this one fragment of a large shunk, which I wasn't sure what it was used for, but it had holes. So this was a recent work in Shahi Tump that found these shells, and when I studied this in 1983, they had not excavated Shahi Tump yet. Now, in retrospect, I would argue that this bangle at Harappa is a repaired version of this earlier form. And we know that Harappa had occupation dating to about the same time period during the Ravi phase, and definitely this could have been curated and used by later people in the Kotdiji phase. So I would argue that this is an old bangle at Harappa demonstrating the same style of ornament found in Baluchistan at 4000 to 3500 BCE. This links the Makran coast with Harappa and the Punjab in a way that nobody had any clue of before. Another very important discovery from Shahi Tump is the slightly later period. It's called period 3A. And in period 3A, they found bangles made of, again, Turbine Laperum, which have grooved designs. Now, this grooved design requires a very specialized tool. It requires grinding and polishing. It's a very complicated way to take a shell and make it more decorative. There are species of shell that have natural grooves, but they don't have this massive structure, and these are clearly made from Turbine Laperum. So this new style suggests that changes of ornament style were occurring and that people were innovating and developing new ways to make ornaments of shell, but that they were still important to make them out of Turbine Laperum. And in my dissertation, I studied the shells from Surkotra, and Surkotra also has one of these wide grooved bangles. Now, the excavations of Surkotra identified the site as being Harappan, but they also found burials outside the walled settlement that they claim might be early Harappan. And so this discovery of this bangle, it may be an early Harappan bangle, and Surkotra might have an early Harappan occupation that has not been located in the current excavations. This bangle and these bangles look very similar to me, and I would argue that this is also a new link that links Makran to Kutch at a very early time period, during the early Harappan. Now, whether it's people moving or objects moving, we don't know, but it would be interesting to see if this might be bangles worn by women from Makran coming to Kutch, or maybe made in Kutch and traded to Makran. We don't know the direction. And this brings me to the next topic, which is the burial in Sarazm. And Sarazm, Tajikistan, is one of the most important sites. It's a UNESCO heritage site. You can go online and look at these photos in greater detail. It was excavated by teams from Tajikistan, as well as Dr. Roland Bessenval, who provided me this photograph. And this site has a burial of a woman, as well as a man and a child, in an enclosure. This enclosure dates to possibly the late 4th to 3rd millennium BC, which would be the early Harappan period. The female burial had thousands of fired steatite, carnelian, lapis, turquoise, gold, silver beads. They were in her hair, they were on her clothing, extremely elaborate burial things. But she also was wearing a large bracelet made of shell. There's only one depicted here, but I believe that both of them were being worn. So this one must be in another museum. This is that same bangle. Now, this bangle is identical to the one from Shahi Tump, but Shahi Tump is located near the Makran coast, and Sarazm is 1,500 kilometers to the north. How did this shell bangle get to Sarazm? It would have probably gone overland through the many different mountain passes. This is not far from where people are collecting lapis in Badakhshan. It's not far from the route for the turquoise coming to Mehergarh. So it suggests that there were very vibrant trade networks linking people from the coast to Central Asia during this time period, and that we have to understand that people were moving. And the question is this woman from Baluchistan, who then was married to a trader in Central Asia, or maybe she was a trader, and she was eventually buried here, or are the Bangles moving and people in Central Asia taking on the designs and styles of people from another region? My own feeling is that this is probably a woman who moved from Baluchistan to Central Asia. Now we can test this by DNA, and I'm not sure if people have been able to get DNA from the skeleton, but I'm going to be contacting colleagues to see if they can test this to see that if we can identify this. Oman is another region which has important links to the Indus, and we know this from much later periods, but during this early Harappan period, we also are starting to find possibly Kotdijian style pottery in Ras Al Had and in Salut, sorry, and then also possible links to certain beads coming over here that might be early Harappan. And the site of Shahi Tump is right over here, but important site here is Ras Al Khamra. In Ras Al Khamra, we have the only evidence for the use of shell bangles, or bracelets actually, from Oman. Now the burials at Ras Al Khamra are part of a settlement that is along the coast where they had rich fishing. Today the modern city of Muscat is built over this whole area, but they've preserved one part of the burials for the heritage park. Male and female burials were wearing these types of bracelets. And they're not bangles because they're made of segments joined together. And they're not Turbine Laperum, they are conus. So this is an adaptation of a bangle tradition using a different shell that cannot be made into the same large form. But they clearly were, I think, copying or similar to bracelets found on the other coast. Now what's really interesting is that this time period between 37 and 3200 is the only time period that we have these types of bracelets being used in Oman and the UAE. After that, the bracelet tradition stops. So none of the burials have these large gauntlets, and nobody in Oman or UAE continues this tradition in the later time periods. Even during the Harappan period, when we have evidence of Indus trade, there's no evidence of Indus bangles being brought over as a trade item. So later Hafid period shows tombs, and they have shell. They have Engina mendicaria. They have conus. They have pinctada. They have the dentalium, but no use of bangles. And I'm comparing here also the beads, the shell from the Hafid tombs with the ones from Mehergarh that I showed earlier. So these are 7000 BC from Mehergarh. These are about 3200 BC from Jebel Hafid. But this species of shell is not commonly found on the Makran coast. And certain types of conus, very large conus, are also not found. So it's possible that this Engina mendicaria and the conus, and maybe even the pinctada, the mother of pearl, could have come from Oman and be traded across back and forth during this early time period. Another very important link to long-distance trade during the early Harappan period is this cylinder seal. If you look in any catalog, this cylinder seal is very famous. It was found or it's attributed to the late Uruk and Jemdet Nasr period, and it has been described as being made of limestone. I was able to look at this very closely at an exhibition in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and as soon as I looked at it, I could see these tiny little dots are holes drilled by worms in Turbine Laperum shells. So I can conclusively say this is not limestone, this is shell. You can also see the spiral structure of the shell. So this is a large, very, very large, almost 3 centimeters in diameter, columella of Turbine Laperum, and the only place they could get it is the Indus. This means that during the early Harappan period, people were trading the columella from the central part of large Turbine Laperum shells as trade items either overland to Mesopotamia or along the coast, we don't know, but somehow they were getting here and then being made into very specialized ritual objects. And shell was later used for many cylinder seals in this region, and we have many of them during the later urban phase. So the regionalization period of the Indus is important for indicating links between the coastal regions and the interior areas, as well as links between the coastal regions of the Indus and possibly Oman, and definitely Mesopotamia. And we can also look at the important links between different parts of the Indus during this time period and the coastal and inland areas. So Harappa is over 800 kilometers from the coast. But at Harappa, we have shell ornaments and shell bangles that were clearly coming from either the areas near Karachi, which is the closest source, or possibly from Kutch. We also have carnelian coming to Harappa, and that would have been coming from Gujarat. So carnelian and shell may have been traveling together, we don't know. But there's clear evidence of long-distance trade from the coastal regions to the central Punjab area and northern sites in Pakistan, and also northern India. This is a time period during the early Harappan or regionalization era when we start seeing the emergence of shared ideologies across the larger regions of the Indus. We can see this in pottery, we can see this in the styles of painted designs, we can see this in the use of handi, a cooking pot, for specific types of cooking of Indus-style foods. And shell is also probably one of the important shared ideologies that was spreading. And I argue that there are at least 10 different regional cultures that were developing, each of them with important distinctive characteristics that eventually became incorporated into the Indus. So I've talked a little bit about the shell already from the Makran and its link to Mehergarh and then Central Asia and Baluchistan and then eventually Oman. But this area of Kutch and Kathiawar is very important for the shell as well. And shell working was clearly being developed in this region. And if Surkotra had a bangle that's similar to Shahi Tump, it means that there were links between these regions as well. And I don't think we need to separate them as two separate areas, but just geographically they are very distant. There would be very little shell in the delta because the delta sediments don't allow these species to exist. So they had to have been found in the areas of the Little Rann of Kutch near Beit Dwarka and in this area. So this is where the Shank would have come from. We have clear evidence of movement of shell inland. We have sites along the Hakra Nara River. We have sites along the Indus. And then we have sites even far north in KPK and Gumla and Remanderi and Bannu, which have evidence for shell during this early time period. But I'm just going to give a few examples. So even though I've emphasized already the role of Makran, new discoveries in Kutch are showing this, and I'm sure that later papers in this conference will give more details, but I just want to emphasize the importance of this site, Junakatya. So Dr. Rajesh SV provided me these photographs of shell bangles from the early Harappan period of Junakatya, which were found, one of them in a burial and two of them from the surface. This bangle is not made from sawing the conch shell, and it's made from chipping and grinding. So this is important to differentiate. So the angle of which is cut clearly indicates that they took an entire shell and they crushed it and cut it up, but they made a thin bangle. So whereas Mehergarh showed wide bangles and Surkotra showed wide bangles, the development of narrow bangles may have been originating in Kutch in this region as opposed to other areas. So this are rings from the tip of a small shell. This is from a very large shell. These holes from the worms indicate that the shell was probably what we call post-fossil. So it's a fossil shell. It's a shell that had died and was laying on the beach or laying in the water, and the worms were eating it to get the calcium, and somebody collected it and then decided to make it into a bangle. To get large shells that do not have wormholes, you have to dive. You have to go into deep water. These smaller shells might have washed up on the beach, so you can collect them sometimes, but they would have been used possibly not as bracelets or maybe for children, or possibly as hair rings, and we'll talk about that later. So Junakatya, I think, is a very important site for the earliest evidence for thin shell bangles that come from the early Harappan period, and Gujarat might have been the place where the earliest forms were being discovered. If we go to inland areas, Jalilpur is a site excavated by Dr. Rafiq Mughal, one of the first sites that showed early Harappan occupation in the Punjab, and that site also has thin shell bangles. So the question is, did these thin shell bangles come from the Makran coast, or did they come from the Gujarat region? And these bangles are sawn. They're not made with chipping and grinding. They appear to have been sawn with the technology of bronze, which I'll talk about later. So I'm introducing some concepts of technology as well. And Jalilpur excavations were not relatively small, but they provided a very good kind of foundation for our research at Harappa, because at Harappa, we were able to study the earliest developments of different technologies, and obviously shell technology was one of my important focuses. And we were able to find in certain areas of the site horizontal excavation occupations of the earliest phase of occupation, which is the Ravi phase here, though we do have Neolithic and Paleolithic in other areas. But the Ravi phase occupation shows the beginnings of what we would call Harappan style of architecture and many styles of ornaments that relate to the later Indus tradition. So we have bricks with a 1:2:4 ratio, and we also have huts that are north, south, east, west, and houses built with mud brick. And this is an area where we see also craft workshops for bead making, but I'm going to focus today on bangles. So from this early level, we didn't expose a very large area, so we don't have a big sample. We have one terracotta bangle. This is very crudely made, pinched. All the rest of the bangles here are from the Kotdiji phase. But we have evidence of terracotta bangles. From this phase, we also have shell bangles. And some of the shell bangles from this level are wide, like the ones I talked about in Mehergarh, and also Surkotada, in Shahi Tump. And some of them are thin. And the thin bangles are clearly made by sawing. This one would have been made by chipping. We also have evidence for manufacturing debris. So this is not a lot of it. There's a little bit of it. And I need to have broader excavations before I can become really convinced of this. And I was very careful to remove rodent holes. So this is, I don't believe, coming from the later Harappan period down into the Ravi phase. I believe these are good evidence for Ravi phase thin bangles and wide bangles. So this would indicate that Harappa has early evidence for the production of both wide and narrow bangles. And I will talk about the implications of wide and narrow bangles a bit later. We also see other technologies associated with this regionalization period. So in the Kotdiji phase, we have lots of bangle styles and many shell bangles. We also have ornaments depicted on figurines. And we also have another very important ornament, tika, which is made in the Ravi phase of clay, but also seen in the Kotdiji phase modeled on a figurine. So the tika and the bangles and the style of beads that were being made and the use of a case of skirts all linked to identity and cultural identity, and we call ethnicity of what we call early Harappan communities. The tika is very distinctive to southern Pakistan and Kutch and regions in the south. So this is a style of ornament that we can then now link to Harappa. And in the Punjab, it's also found as a form in later time periods, but from Harappan period, we can say that this is also the earliest evidence of tika. The Kotdijian phase also sees the emergence of writing, so the development of bangles and shell ornaments as an important form of identity coincides with the development of weight system and writing system, which I won't talk about, but I wanted to include that to help you understand it's a big package of material that relates to the identity of the Indus communities. And then we see the integration era. The integration era is when these settlements, like Harappa, became large cities. The areas of the Ravi occupation are in the north part of this mound AB and on the eastern part of mound E. Eventually those settlements became very large during the Kotdiji phase and then even bigger during the Harappa phase. And this is when we start seeing the emergence of many styles and forms that we call Harappan, but actually they belong to the early Harappan. They started in the early Harappan and continued. So shell bangles can be seen starting in the early Harappan and continuing on into the Harappan period. Ornaments, including bangles, were very important for identifying status and power, and some of the female figurines that we see have specialized headdresses. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we do have figurines in Mesopotamia at the site of Mari, which have headdresses that are similar to those in the Indus. So the role of women as traders and as people who were moving over great distances and carrying with them their identity and their styles is clearly important for understanding the Indus tradition and its links to other regions. Bangles become a very important form of, I would say, nonverbal communication during the Indus. Shell bangles we've seen starting in the early Harappan. We also have terracotta bangles from the early Harappan, but they become quite elaborate during the Harappan period. We see narrow shell bangles and we see wide shell bangles. We also see stoneware and faience and glazed bangles and gold and bronze and silver and some very few ivory bangles, but we do have a few ivory bangles. And what's really important is that bangles tend to be worn primarily by females, as we can see from the burials, but we also see depictions of male figures that are wearing bangles, and we have burials of males with shell circlets or bangles that are worn either on the hand or on the hair. The other point that I want to emphasize here, which I'll come back to as we proceed, is that shell bangles from the Indus have been found in Susa, in Iran. They've been found in Mesopotamia, and I mentioned earlier in Central Asia, and I'm sure that more will be found over the years. So where were these things being made? The earlier excavators were focusing on Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and that's what I did my dissertation on, though I did look at some other sites, which I'll talk about. So when I began doing my dissertation research, I wanted to find evidence for manufacture. So I could find here is the large Lambus truncata cibi, very, very big, thick shells. And they cut these and they made them into large plaques that they were used to make different types of objects. They also used Turbine Laperum, and these shells were brought to the big cities from the coast and then manufactured into forms of ornaments and inlay and other objects. So we do have clear evidence for manufacture in the large urban centers, and this provides us some clue as to the ways in which Indus elites were controlling production and also creating objects that were very distinctive to urban centers. So the kinds of things needed in urban centers included ornaments, inlay, and specialized objects that would be used for ritual purposes. Evidence for manufacture included unfinished objects as well as finished pieces, and we have processing pieces that were being in the middle of making something but they never finished. We also have Turbine Laperum columella that were partially ground that could have been made at Mohenjo-daro, but they could also, as I'm going to be demonstrating, coming from other regions. As part of my dissertation, I tried to replicate and understand the technologies. So I did this by studying the objects, looking at them carefully, and trying to replicate each stage of production. And this is the drawings that I made showing the chipping of the tip, the breaking of the columella, the sawing of the piece, the slicing of it. This is a sawing technique that was highly developed and clearly was being done in the large urban centers, and as I'll point out, was also being done in coastal regions. So you finely grind and polish, and Indus shell bangles tended to have a very simple design with a V-shaped design, which may have been the mouth of a snake or dotted with eyes, we don't know, but rarely a more complex form. So this is a very simple form of bangle. To study this, I went to Bengal, and I went to different workshops, and many of you are already familiar with my work, but I just want to emphasize that I would not be able to know any of this if it hadn't been for the fact that I was able to work with Robi Nandi and his father, Ashwini Kumar Nandi, in Bishnupur, and then many craftsmen in Barakpur in northern Calcutta. I eventually went to Dhaka and met some shell workers in Dhaka, but when I was doing my dissertation work, I mainly focused in India. So this is Robinandi, who actually came to America to demonstrate Shankari work and demonstrating the use of a korat, which is a specialized saw, and a special way for cutting. I documented the depth of each saw cut from the modern saw. I compared that with the depth of each saw cut on ancient shell pieces from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. And from the depth, we can say that the depth of cutting of a bronze saw of the Harappan period was just as effective as the saws of the modern steel. So this means that Harappan saws were, and they were just as thin, 0.7 millimeters in thickness, and they were heavily, probably made in exactly the same way, though we've never found any. And it indicates that bronze saws were as hard as steel. Now, people may say, how can this happen? Bronze is not going to be as hard as steel, but actually arsenical bronze can be made very hard and brittle. And arsenical bronze is something that we know was being produced in Baluchistan and also possibly in Rajasthan, because we have arsenic mixed with some of the copper in those regions. So my feeling is that Harappan shell workers were using highly specialized tools to make sawn bangles, and they were developing a bronze that was as hard as steel to be able to do that. Now, that was one aspect of my research, but the other aspect was work that I started in Balakot when I was a student, working with Dr. Dales. So my first excavation experience was in Balakot, and Dr. Dales put me in this area to excavate this area, and that's when I got interested in shell, because along the surface of this road there were many shell bangles and broken shell objects, and I started looking at them, and he said, oh, they're all shell, just put them in a bag and they're shell. I said, well, they're not all shell. There's different kinds of shell here. And he says, what do you mean? I said, and then I looked at the shells and I explained to him that some of them are shank, which I was familiar with because I grew up in Bengal and I saw shankaris and I was able to see this. Some of them are conus, some of them are spondylus, but importantly, some of them are another species. So this shell bangle, which at that time people would say, oh, shell bangles, they're all the same. And after looking at it, I realized that this is not the same, and this type of triangular shell was being used to make a bangle that was identical to the shanka that we were made by sawing. So I was able to do some experimental replication and figured out that these entire bangles were made only by chipping and grinding, so no use of a saw. And in my thesis, I argue that this demonstrates a parallel technology to create a symbolic object made by people in a community, coastal community, who had access to this shell, and that this may reflect, two different levels of shell ornaments. So people who can wear sawn shell bangles, they may have been more valuable, they may have been more elite, whereas people who didn't have the money to buy a sawn shell could make one themselves by sitting there and grinding and chipping. Now, at that time, I didn't know as much as I do now, so I'm going to probably, when I rewrite my dissertation and revise it, I may argue slightly differently, because we do not have the early sites in the coastal regions that help us understand the beginnings of this technology. So while I mentioned that Junakatya might be the earliest thin bangle of Shanka, this is definitely the earliest form of thin bangle made of Damaoides, so Tivula Damaoides. So this is also a thin, you can't make a thick bangle out of this. So possibly this is a style from Makran that was being developed parallel. But unfortunately, we don't have any early sites that show this. All the sites that have these bangles date from the Harappan period, and we don't have anything that goes much earlier. So these are examples of the Tivula Damaoides bangles, which are triangular in shape, and these are the ones made from sawing of Turbine Laperum, and they're more circular shape. And if you're excavating a site anywhere in Kutch or Sindh, please pay attention to this, because I found an example of this type of bangle in Lothal. I've seen them in Mohenjo-daro, that excavated by Dr. Aurore Didier now. We know that they're found in the coastal regions of Makran. One of my colleagues, Zulfikar Kaloro has shown me photographs of this type of bangle found from looted tombs in interior Sindh, and we have an example at Harappa. So for a bangle of this type to be found at Harappa means that somebody made it on the coast. It's also found in Aladino, sorry. So Aladino, Lotal, Sutkako, Chanhudaro, and sites in Sindh. And then at Harappa. So it means that possibly a woman wearing this bangle, or maybe a man, moved from the coast to the inland areas and wore that style of bangle with them. So more studies will probably identify many more of this form of bangle, but it reflects a parallel tradition. And most recently, I've been working in Oman, where I've had the chance to go to the beach and look for shells, and this species is found very commonly in the coastal Oman region. I was never able to find one in the areas that I had access to in the Makran, and that's possibly because the areas that I wanted to look at are restricted and I couldn't go there. But it's possible that this species, even in Balakot, came from Oman. Now, I don't know for sure, but there are no shells of this type being sold in any of the markets in Karachi or in any of the markets in Sindh. So it means that it's not locally available today. And I was not able to find it when I did my surveys along the coast. But it's very common in Oman. So maybe even during the Harappan period, they were bringing this shell from Oman to the Indus Valley, and then local people were making them. So this is something I'm still trying to study. So we have a couple scenarios here. We have Kutch, which has early evidence for thin bangles made from shunk, but made with chipping and grinding. We have Balakot, which has, during the Harappan period, thin bangles made from a clam shell, and then thin bangles made from sawn shells. So the question then, which we need to figure out, is who developed the sawing technique for making these bangles, and where did the technology of making the bronze saws develop? Because this the technology was clearly developing in coastal regions and then brought to the big cities. And this is where the studies of coastal sites in Gujarat come in. And I know that some other papers in this conference will focus on Gujarat, so I apologize in advance for taking some of the details, but I was able to study Nageshwar with Dr. Ban when we were students together. And this is one of the important sites, Bimgaja Talao and Nageshwar, where we began our collaborative studies on early shell traditions. So I especially want to thank Kuldeep for his help and also allowing me to participate with him. The sources of these shells are in Pindara Bay and Pushitara Bay, and also in Bait, which is just further off the coast here. So this is where people were diving and collecting these species, bringing them here to this site next to this small lake. The shell banks are still being exploited to some extent, but most of the shells now are coming from other areas, and especially South India. And these areas they're called Kutchi shells, are not being exploited as much anymore. At Nageshwar, we found evidence for huge amounts of manufacturing debris. So large shells that were partially opened, tips and the core area after they'd been sawn and removed. These are shells that were being made into bangles and then cut to make small pieces of inlay. We found shells from Chicorius ramosus that were used to make ladles, but also for making bangles. And this is where I became exposed to the knowledge that Chicorius ramosus, a very spiny shell, was also being heavily processed to make large, very, very large bangles, which might have been payal or ankle bracelets. But as you'll see, some of them may have also been used as hair ornaments. So these are fragments that we can identify as T. pyrum. And then this is ramosus, showing two different colors also of the shell as it ages. The white shell, the Turbine Laperum, stays much whiter as it gets older. But what was very surprising is the huge amounts of manufacturing debris. All of the excavations of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, I would say Rakigarhi, Dholavira, do not have as many columella as is found just at the one side of Nagwara. Now, I can't give you specific numbers because we don't have exact counts of everything, but this small settlement had large quantities of manufacturing debris, and very small numbers of finished objects and things that would have been used locally. So they were processing raw materials and then sending off unfinished pieces to the large cities. This is what we've concluded, Dr. Bond and I. So this is a very important indication of intense production in local areas. They were being sawn there, they were being collected there, they were being processed there, and they were sending off blanks or possibly some finished objects to the big cities. Ladles, bangles, inlay, etc. Then other excavations by the MS University team has also shown a site of Bagasara or Goladoro, which is not far from Nageshwar. It's just up the coast in Kathiawar, and this site had evidence for a major shell workshop. Now, when this was discovered, they first found the shells on the top, thanks to Kuldeep Bond for these photographs, and then they dug a bit lower, and then they found evidence for a large container that had thousands of bangles in it. And this was found in a small walled settlement. So Bagasara is a very small settlement. It's not very large. And there was found a workshop inside the walls. So it indicates that somebody began collecting lots of shells and processing lots of shells, but then why did they leave them there? Why did they just leave all of these very valuable materials and processed and unprocessed shells in a house? This structure and this workshop was built on top of, and people continued to live at the site for many generations later. And everyone knows that in a village of this size, everyone would know what's in everybody's house, because the children will talk to each other and they'll say, oh, my father is a shell worker and we got this big basket full of shell bangles sitting in our house, but why aren't you selling them? Why aren't you sawing these shells? Why are you leaving them in this house? So this is a question I'm going to ask you all to think about. How do we explain these types of hoards? The site was not destroyed by a volcano. It was not destroyed by warfare. This house and this workshop with the shell bangles was abandoned. So why was it abandoned? And why did nobody ever come in this room and take the shells out? Now, it may have been Oshobo or inauspicious to go into this room. Maybe somebody died there, maybe something happened. Whatever it was, the room was sealed off and nobody ever came in there and everything was left. The same thing happened to the stone workshop, which is not next door, but I'm not going to talk about. So just to give you an idea, there were thousands of unfinished and some finished bangles in what would be a basket, and some pieces laying on the floor. You have thousands of unprocessed Turbine Laperum collected in piles, and numerous piles. Outside in the site there are other finished objects, and including one of these multiple groove bangles, which is slightly different than the one from Surkotada and from Shaitump, but it also indicates that possibly some regional forms of these continued on. And one of the important discoveries here, which is often overlooked, is that one of the shells among these many, many shells was what we call a sinistral conch, or Dakshinavarta Shank. Now, in later traditions and in modern Hinduism and in India, this shank, which is turning to the other direction, one is called Vamavarta and the other one is Dakshinavarta. Dakshinavarta shank are supposed to be extremely valuable for specific rituals. But obviously the Harappans didn't have any notice of this, or they didn't pay any attention, because this was sitting with all of these other shells getting ready to be sawn, and nobody clearly indicated that this was turning another direction. So most shank are Vamavarta, which is turning to the right, and this is turning to the left depending on how you orient it. Okay, so this is an example of a Dakshinavarta shank, which are very valuable in India today and are used in many temples throughout South Asia. Compared to Bagasara, Shikarpur, which has been excavated by the MSU team as well, Dr. Bond and I went to the site and discussed how important it was to excavate, and I'm really glad that he and then later Ajit Prasad and Dr. Krishnan continued to work here. This site has evidence of shell working, but not on the scale of Bagasara. And so we can see that there are lots of finished bangles from Shikarpur, but Bagasara has many, many more. And Dr. Brad Chase is also working with the team to talk about these crafts. I won't go into more detail, but I just wanted to give you a range of different sites that have different perspectives on the early shell traditions. And then we go, what happened to all those shells that were being made in Gujarat and possibly Balakot? They were being sent inland to the big cities because at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro we have a little bit of manufacture, but not a whole lot. And the people who were manufacturing in these big cities were probably people from coastal regions moving to the big cities to work in the big city workshops. So in the big cities we have evidence of female use of shell bangles, and this is an example of a burial with bangles on the left arm. This figurine shows many bangles, so they took off the silver and the gold and the terracotta, but they left the shell bangles on. And I argue that this suggests that the shell bangles had some specific value that could not be inherited by the daughter. You could not give these to your children. They had to be taken with you in the afterlife. So what that means, we don't know, but it's something that indicates that Harappan women it was important for them to wear their shell bangles. And we have examples. This is a view of this excavation during the process of excavation. And then we have evidence, and I measured the bangles, that the bangles from the lower levels of the cemetery, the earliest ones, are slightly wider and sturdier. But by the late phase of the Harappa cemetery, the bangles are very, very thin. And shell bangles that are very thin will break very easily. And women who do manual labor might have been able to wear these bangles and make chapatis and chop wood and clean the house. But women who wore very thin bangles probably did not do manual labor. And I argue that this reflects that these women are actually elites, and that over time Harappan women represented by these burials became more elite to the point where they were telling people what to do and not actually doing a lot of labor. We do, however, have wide bangles at Harappa, but they're not found in the cemetery. No women are buried with wide bangles, unlike Balochistan and Shahi Tomb. So these wide bangles may reflect women who are nomads or from a different ethnic community. And we know that today the women who wear wide, heavy bangles are often laborers. They work on the road crews, they build the highways, and they do heavy labor in the fields. And one reason why they wear heavy bangles is so they won't break. So this is an indication that some women in Harappa were wearing large bangles. And the large bangles are the ones that we see in Susa and possibly in Mesopotamia. We also have men wearing bangles. So one man has a fragment of a bangle by his hand, but we also have ornaments in the hair. So this is an example of a burial of a male who had a hair ornament made of hundreds of thousands of tiny microbeads, but also 3 shell rings and a jasper bead, which were included in this hair ornament. And we didn't find them until we took the skull out. We saw a white powdery surface, and when we look closely, we realized that that's not white powder. It's not calcium carbonate in the soil. It actually is our microbeads. So we kept this all there. If you go to Harappa Museum today, you'll see this exhibit showing this in the matrix. This was conserved at the Smithsonian and presented back to Pakistan for display. So I just got a copy of the Kalibangan report, and I noticed this image of burial number 26, which shows a large shell ring next to the left ear of this male. So again, a male burial and a shell ring that they say probably is not a bangle, but maybe an earring. And looking at the shape, I argue that this is probably Chicorius ramosus, that species of a large spiky shell. And it's possible that this was also part of a hair ornament, not an earring. So you can put your hair through it, you can use it as a ring. But so we need to think of bracelets or bangles not just as ornaments on the hand, but also worn in the hair. Other shell objects, and I'm getting kind of late here. There's a lot of things I want to talk about, but other shell objects were made from the heavy parts of shell that could not be made into bangles, and they used lambus truncata to make carved bull figurines, composite figures, inlay, segmented rods, discs that could be put on clothing and the hair. And this is one of the most famous shell objects that in the past has been called a scale. I don't agree it's a scale. There's only been one found in the entire Indus civilization, so you'd think that if they were making rulers, they would have made many of them because they would have been important for everyday life. So I argue that this is actually a piece of inlay, may have been for some astronomical use or some other very specialized use, but it's probably not a scale. It's uniform, but that doesn't mean it's used for measuring anything. So this is the piece from Mohenjo-daro. Other pieces of shell were used to make inlay, and some of the inlay designs relate to pottery styles of pottery painting, so intersecting circles. And then you can make intersecting circles with segments of inlay. And then we have different forms of zigzags and T-shapes that are put in together and stepped crosses. This form, which the British scholars called the kidney shape because they thought it looked like a kidney, I argue is actually a womb shape. So it's the shape of a womb motif, which is also found in mandalas, where we see the Shashti design being presented. And it's found in the womb of a unicorn here, and I would argue that it probably reflects some kind of idea of fertility. Finally, we have ritual objects that we clearly associate with not for food or consumption, but for special rituals. And we have conch shells that have been hollowed out, and these were made with Turbine Laperum. And we have ladles made from Chicorius ramosus, and some of them have additional circles around them and colored inlay. So from Mohenjo-daro, we have examples, ones with red pigment in the grooves. And these are probably used for pouring liquids or serving medicines to children for special reasons, but we don't have them made in clay. They're only made in shell, and I would argue that they were probably only for special rituals. This is later called a Joloshank or a panishank. And this shell was found in a burial, but these have been found in the site of Mohenjo-daro. At Harappa, we also have one example of a trumpet. Now, this was excavated by Vats. They didn't tell us where they found it. It could be from a later period, but it's linked to the Harappa excavations, and I argue that it may represent the earliest use of shank as a baidushank, or a trumpet, which would have been used for calling. Or for making a sound. Now, if this had been a common tradition of the Indus, we should have found many of them at all the sites. But so far, I don't know of any other site that has found a shank that is a baidushank. So we need to look for this more in other excavation reports. The use of these types of ritual objects, you would think, were only found in the Indus. And if they are specifically with Indus rituals, then we would expect them to be found only in Indus sites. But it's very interesting that the sites that the Indus were trading with, which include all the way into Failaka, which is just off the coast of Mesopotamia, linked to the Indus through pottery styles, and we can see the presence of Indus-style seals, which are now called Gulf seals. But at the site of Failaka, Professor Højlund from Denmark found a fragment of one of these shell ladles. And these were found in association with tombs, which are circular, that have chambers in them, which, if you're familiar with the excavation in Dholavira, there are several of these tombs in Dholavira as well. So more research needs to be done on these tombs in Failaka, their links to Dholavira, and the use of a ritual object of Indus style found in this area, which would suggest that Indus communities using their rituals were also present in areas such as Failaka. So in terms of communication, we have Indus-style bangles in Susa. We know that Indus-style ornaments and lapis and carnelian and headdresses and ladles now are found outside of the region. This would suggest that many Indus people with their ritual traditions and their ritual objects were traveling and moving to regions outside of the Indus. But at the end of the Indus period, what happens to this? Do they continue to be used? Are they perpetuated in later time periods or not? This is something that we still need to study. And so at the end of the Indus tradition, we also start seeing some changes. And I'm not going to go into the details of the late Harappan, but basically the late Harappan period sees a a transformation of the landscape. We see some rivers drying up. We see potential for movements of people. And basically we have a breakdown of trade networks that results in a totally reorganized form of social networks and then ideology. So the late Harappan in the Punjab, we see a new burial tradition, no more extended burials, people buried in vessels that we have the bones exposed. We see different traditions in Sanauli, which is in the upper Ganga region. We have other regions in Gujarat where we have a dispersal of communities into smaller settlements. And the Baluchistan region also sees transformations that I don't have time to go into. But during the late Harappan, many aspects of Harappan culture disappear. No seals and molded tablets, no evidence for inscriptions on pottery, the disappearance of the unicorn motif, and what's very important is the disappearance of shell bangles and marine shell from all the sites in the north. So in the late Harappan period at Harappa, we don't have a lot of shell bangles. We don't have evidence for the shell. And as far as I'm aware, they're not found in other sites in the Ganga Doab region as well. So why did shell all of a sudden stop in the north? It must be a breakdown in trade networks. And then the question is, did it continue in the regions of Gujarat? So I know the MS University team has excavated at Jaidak. I haven't looked at the stratigraphy to see if there are shell bangles found in the late phase at Jaidak. I know that they're found in the Harappa phase. So the question is, did shell continue in Gujarat even though it did not continue in the north? Because this area clearly had shell, they had the technology, they had the traditions, and we would expect to see continuities of the shell use in this region. We don't know also from any late Harappan sites along the coast of the Makran, so this is another area that needs more research. We do know, however, that shell becomes very important at the very end of the PGW, or definitely during the NBP periods, and that this shows a resurgence of links to the coast, bringing shell from the coastal regions into the northern parts of the subcontinent. The question that I have for scholars here, and maybe some people can address this, based on my own studies and discussion with Sanskrit scholars, the word shank does not appear in the Rig Veda, and there's no mention of ritual objects made of shell in the Rig Veda. So the earliest Vedic text does not have this. However, in later Vedic texts, and definitely by the epic period, we have clear evidence for the use of Joloshank and Joloshank and shell bangles. All of these things become very common. So the question is, we need better sites that help date these time periods between the regions of Kutch and Gujarat, and then the central regions of the Indus, and then also the Gangetic Plain, because by the early historic period, everybody's using shank again. They're using shell bangles, they're using Vaidya-shank, they're using shell ladles, they're using all kinds of ornaments, shell rings, and this is a site of Bait in Kutch, which dates between the 6th century and 15th century, where there's considerable evidence for the shell working. And I know some papers in this conference will be talking about that in more detail. So I just want to conclude that shell never disappeared from the subcontinent. It started in the Indus civilization. It continued to be a sacred material in later time periods. It's still represented in all of the major religious traditions in Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism. This is my friend Ravi Shankar in Benares showing me the Shanka Mudra. And this is a symbol that very important part of rituals. We know the use of ladles and Joloshank and Vaidya-shank are still used today. And only in Bengal do women still wear shell bangles, because this is a region which has been able to preserve this tradition. Everywhere else in South Asia, ivory or later glass replaced the shell bangles, but clearly the bangle tradition was very important for communities in the major parts of the subcontinent. And I also want to just conclude that not just the core areas, but also peripheral regions show continued use of shell. The same shank is used in Nagaland, it's used in Tibet, and communities throughout Punjab and Sindh use lots of different shells today. They don't make shell bangles, but they still use shell in all of their decorations of their animals and their homes and their cattle and also for themselves. So I want to end today with showing people and the continuity of shell and how important it is for South Asian traditions. And I thank you all for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.